Hamill, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to welcome you to our Mastering Zero Trust Summit, brought to you by Rubrik. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a $500 Target gift card. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor, Rubrik, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik underwriting this summit that we can bring you this great content from industry experts, so we thank them for sponsoring the summit and supporting the community, and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, the new best practices for enterprise zero trust. This session features Howard M. Cohen, a senior consultant at the Tech Channel Partners Results Group. Howard is a 40-plus year executive veteran of the information technology industry who today writes for and about the IT channel. He's a frequent speaker at IT industry events that include Microsoft Inspire, Citrix Energy/Summit, and several others. He also frequently hosts and presents webinars for many vendors and publications, just like he's doing right now. Howard, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you, David. And it's not just 40 years, it's 40 long years in the IT channel. But here we are. And I'd like to welcome everybody to today's session. We're going to be talking about the new best practices for enterprise zero trust. So if you were looking for the 9 a.m. flight to San Francisco, you're on the wrong plane. Thank you. Okay. Those of you who have been with me before in other presentations know that I very much like to start every presentation with a word of the day. Today's word, given that we're talking about zero trust, you won't be surprised that the word is paranoia. Paranoia. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. And indeed, zero trust is founded in the idea that you're paranoid because you believe that everything is a potential threat. Somebody says, hello. Your response, what do you mean by that? No, okay. Everything is a potential threat. I'm sorry, it's early. And your systems are threatened. Networks can be a threat. The files you're using may be threatened. Applications can threaten you. So everything is a potential threat is a healthy skepticism that I say everybody should have, because your healthy skepticism will protect you better than anything else. Okay, so let's go back to the past a little bit, and the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Amongst many other things that President Reagan was famous for saying was his constant admonition to us that we trust but verify. Well, zero trust suggests that President Reagan was all wet about that. Instead, we're going to change this to never trust. Always verify. Verify everything. And once you've verified it, verify it again and again and again and again. That's the underlying philosophy of zero trust. It's total paranoia all the time. And when you're wrong, that's great. When you're right, you're okay. You're protected. You're doing the right thing. So let's compare where we were to where we're going. In the past, we used what has been commonly referred to as a castle and moat strategy for protecting networks and data. So if the networks and the data are the equivalent of this castle that we're looking at, the moat is the firewalls and intrusion prevention systems and all the other things we put around the network to protect it from people getting in. The problem is that over time, those bad actors those cyber criminals, they go out and get themselves boats. And they travel across the moat, get to the castle, scale the walls, and they're in. And they compromise our data and our networks. So castle and moat isn't perfect. And that's why people started looking for another solution. And the solution they came upon is, instead of focusing on that perimeter, on how we're going to build that blockade, let's focus on people who are trying to get in. Let's deal with them instead of the attempt itself. And so zero trust becomes very much a part of a company's culture, because it's all about your people and what they do. It's kind of like compliance, where, there's some digital components to compliance, but for the most part, it's how your people handle data in regulatory environments, regulated environments. And so zero trust, like DevOps, like compliance, like so many other things, has got to become a feature of your company's culture. So, why do we say this? Well, the fact is that 85% of breaches have a human element to them. People are involved in them. It's not some automatic bot crawling through the internet looking for vulnerability. There are people involved in it, 85%. And the cost of their criminality is rising. In 2021, it was $4.24 million per exploit, per breach. It's now, in 2022, it was $4.35 million, heading upward. We expect to see it higher this year, although I haven't found any projections yet. Now, we're all familiar with that coming from external threats, right? That's why we put the walls up, so people outside can't get in. Well, here's the problem. We're still, to this day, threatened internally. There are people inside our organization, inside our firewall, who are doing all kinds of wrong things. And some of them mean to do it. Some of them are intentional. They want to steal company data, usually company data from a department other than their own. So now you're inside the firewall. How do you protect against that? And to some extent, even worse, there's unintentional internal threats. Mistakes. People do stupid things. They just do. It's not because they're stupid, but it's because they're fallible. They're human beings. And so we have to figure out, how do we protect them from themselves? How do we protect everybody from all of these internal and external threats? We start by pointing out to everybody in the culture that everybody suffers when a breach occurs. If a breach costs an average of $4.35 million, one breach is going to result in some reductions in force. People are going to lose their jobs. Budgets are going to get tightened. There are going to be things we can't do that we wanted to do, or that we need to do to remain competitive. And so everybody suffers when a breach occurs, and everybody has to take part in the company's strategy for cybersecurity. It's everybody's responsibility. There is nobody in an organization who doesn't have some kind of responsibilities for things they do properly to enforce and improve the company's security posture. Zero trust is a more holistic approach to that basically comes with three fundamental tenets. Okay, the first one being that you explicitly verify everything. You don't assume that somebody has rights to a certain data volume or what have you. You have to never trust, as we said before, always be verifying, and periodically verify again and again and again. Also, even when you've let somebody into the network, control what they have access to. Instead of giving them access to everything, giving everybody an administrator password, give everybody only access to what they need to get their work done. And then finally, again, here's that paranoia, always assume that you're in the process of being breached. Somebody is out there right now, that 400-pound guy sitting in his basement, is out there trying to break into your network. If you always assume the worst, when something good happens, you're happily surprised. That is the posture you want to take in a zero trust environment. Now let's go back to the beginning of zero trust and talk about the gentleman who actually came up with it. The original author of zero trust is John Kindervag, who at that time was working at Forrester. He's currently a vice president at On2IT, another cybersecurity firm. Kindervag began by saying, define your protect surface. What do you need to protect? And so we're talking about the network. We're talking about the data assets and the servers they're running on and so forth. Notice that Kindervag doesn't say your threat surface or your attack surface. He's not focusing on what's coming. He's focusing on where it's coming to, what it's going after. Because if I can protect that, then it doesn't matter what it gets through. It doesn't get to what I'm trying to protect. And indeed, if you adopt that posture, you're much closer to the real root of the challenge than you would be otherwise. So define your protect surface, not your attack surface or threat surface. Then once you know what you're there to protect, figure out how transactions flow from one thing to another. How do all those different components that we're protecting work with each other? How do they work together? What are the workflows? What are the transitions, the transport events? Once you know all of that and you understand the components and their movement, you can begin to architect your environment, placing the necessary controls where those assets are. The components of your protect surface are where you want to put your controls so that you can create micro-perimeters. He's very big on micro-segmentation. The smaller the segment, the better, because it's easier actually to protect a lot of small things than it is to protect one big thing. You may agree or disagree with that, but that's the position Kindervag took as he developed zero trust. He suggests that as you build your zero trust policy, you do the old Kipling method: who, what, when, where, why, how, and who. I think I said who too, who twice. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Everything is based on that, and if you're that comprehensive, you'll find that you cover just about everything, and anything you don't cover, you cover it when you figure it out. And then finally, he talks about the ongoing challenge of monitoring and maintaining your zero trust environment. How do you gather telemetry? How do you use tools, automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning? What analytics do you apply to understand what's going on in your network environment? And how much can you automate to accelerate things and make things happen faster with fewer errors? Kindervag basically suggested that we approach building zero trust as a path. And he suggests that we have a detailed roadmap that takes us from where we are to where zero trust is. And he points out that in the past, we've always come from the outside in. That is, we started with the security of the network and the perimeter around that network. That was where everything began. And that was supposed to help us protect the devices inside the network, the applications running on those devices, the data being used by those applications, and then finally the users that are taking advantage of the entire system. So we basically went from the outside in toward the user. Zero trust flips that around and says start with the user. Start with the user, move out to the data, the application, the devices, and then finally get out to the perimeter. Not saying that we should rid ourselves of the perimeter. It's perfectly fine that it's there. But we're going to get better protection if we start with identity. Not only identity of people, but identity of those devices too. We'll get more into that. And so let's take a look at Kindervag's idea of a roadmap for zero trust. The components include identity, which we just talked about, workloads, devices, the networks they're all running on, the data that's in use, people and the culture that those people live within. So let's start with identity, and the major tool here is Identity and Access Management, IAM. Identity and Access Management is a core tool within the Zero Trust model. You want to make sure that you have management of everybody's identity and what each person and each object has access to. That's the core of control. In some senses, this begins when a new user enters the company. We all have some kind of onboarding procedure and, of course, an offboarding procedure when somebody has to leave the company. In many cases, those processes are tacit. We just kind of do it this way, and we've always done it that way, so we keep on doing it that way. And that is a mistake. Strongly suggested within the Zero Trust framework that you automate both the onboarding process and the offboarding process. Onboarding because a routinized, consistent, reliable process speaks volumes to that new employee about how seriously you take security and how serious an organization they're joining. It's a good, positive first experience for them to have. Offboarding, because the cause of many exploits is that a person leaves a company, but they're not taken off the network. Nobody removes them. And so therefore they still have their ID, they still have their password, and they can still get on the network. That's disastrous. It almost goes without saying that multi-factor authentication has to be a tool that you use in a Zero Trust environment. You cannot trust passwords. Not because they're weak, you can create a strong password, but because the ways in which people remember passwords can be weak, can be faulty. People are still writing their passwords down on sticky notes and sticking them underneath their keyboard, or worse, on their monitor. It's just all too easy to compromise somebody's passwords by finding them. And so passwords aren't good enough. You really need an automatically generated passcode that gets sent to a user's smartphone or other device, and that combines something they know, their password, with something they have, their smartphone. If they're missing either of those things, they've got to work harder. Also, once they are authenticated, make sure that their access is conditional. That depending on where they are, depending on time of day, depending on what device they're using, their access may change. By having more levers, you have more granularity and more tight control over everything going on your network. So that's a good thing. While we're still talking about passwords, single sign-on is recommended to manage that and have a trusted single sign-on source provide that keychain that opens up all of your applications. One password for you to remember, one authentication to do each day as you log into the entire system. Many strategic advantages to going single sign-on. And finally, it's mandatory in a Zero Trust environment to manage your directory. Every object on your network has to have an identity that has rights, that has configuration criteria, and all kinds of other details. That has to be managed closely. So directory management is, unto itself, a broad best practice. In terms of your workload, you're going to first hear a word that you're going to hear me say over and over and over again, which is visibility. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. But if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you can't see it, you can't even measure it. So visibility is key. And when it comes to resources, it's visibility in context. Where is this resource? What is it meant for? What is it doing now? Who's currently using it? How long have they had it open? I mean, there's all kinds of details that determine whether or not a given resource is in a good condition, a threatened condition, or a fault condition. And so your visibility of most resources needs to be had in context, fully informed. when you're giving people access to these resources, strongly recommended and definitely a universal best practice, role-based access control, RBAC. For those who aren't familiar with RBAC, imagine that you have 10 users on your network, small network. If rights have to be changed, so you go to 10 different user records and you change their rights. Not so terrible. What if it's 10,000 users? It's insane to think that you're going to go to 10,000 different records and make changes on each one. Instead, assign a role to each of those users. And so let's say 500 end up in one role and 1,000 end up in another role, and all told you may have 10 roles. We're back to that manageable number. You can make the change in rights on those 10 different roles, and all the people in each role get that change. So RBAC reduces errors tremendously and slashes the time it takes to establish new controls when they're needed. Also, in the course of this presentation, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that sound like tools, RBAC being one of them. We're recommending a transition. No longer should we be looking for best-of-breed tools, but rather we're transitioning to best-of-breed platforms or best-of platforms. Why? When you have a tool, you probably have one or two people who know how to use it, and if those people leave, you have a useless tool. If a lot of people are using it, they've got to get trained on it. And then they have to get trained on another tool and another tool and another tool. They need support for all those tools. They need license renewals for all those tools. It gets to be a mess. When you've got best of platform, you've got a singular user interface that everybody can learn. You've got one set of training, one set of support, one set of license requirements. It's just so much easier to maintain. Now, it's difficult to find a platform that gives you everything you need, but it is absolutely viable to come up with something that is a very, very, very good compromise where you give up very little by going to best of platform. So I consider best of platform to be a best practice in today's IT environment, and especially in zero trust. Which brings us to devices. Guess what I'm going to ask for first in devices? You betcha. Visibility. If a device is on my network, I want to see it. I want to know it's there. You wouldn't believe how many threats, how many compromises, how many exploits happen simply because there were devices on the network that nobody knew about. How does that happen? It can't happen. So just as you're authenticating and authorizing users, people, you also want to authorize their device. When a device tries to sign on to your network has to interrogate that device, determine if it has adequate security measures in place, whether it's configured properly for access to your network. Once your network is satisfied, only then can the device gain access to any resources on your network, and all of that is proscribed by your directory control. There's no way a device can get on without your knowing and without it being visible to you. One potential exception that we need to pay special attention to are things in the Internet of Things, devices that are out there like controls and sensors, usually buried in something, in a building or on a light, a street lamp or a telephone pole. They could be anywhere, in somebody's ceiling. They're small, they're low powered. They usually run on small, lossy little networks that are connected in. They require a lot of attention up front. Before they get installed, they have to be hardened. You have to be sure you've done as much as you can, because once they're installed, they're going to be infinitely harder to change. Other things are attached to people or embedded with people, things like smartphones. And the last thing you want is to give control of a device to its user. you want to maintain control over that mobile device for many reasons. Your corporate data assets are on that device. Therefore, you must have control over it. You must be able to brick it if you have to, if it's stolen or lost. So mobile device management has become a best practice in a zero trust environment that includes mobile devices. What environment doesn't these days? Also, there's a requirement, it's mandatory, that you actively manage patches and updates. Don't just set them to automatic and let them just fire off. You never know what they're going to break. So you need to evaluate them. You need to determine that they won't break anything, and only then allow them to be deployed as rapidly as possible to get that protection. Devices all connect up to your network. And of course, you want visibility of every item on your infrastructure, every router, every switch, every hub, you name it. If it's on the network, you've got to be able to see it. And so you want to see every connection. One of the most important things, the concept of the routers and modems that connect you to the internet or to other connections across a wide area circuit. Not for nothing, but those circuits are not in your control. They're in the control of your carrier. So you need to have control of the devices on either end so you can determine when a carrier circuit has failed or when your connection to the network has failed or if there's an anomaly going on there. And so you need to have very, very close monitoring of everything, not only in the core where the routers and switches and servers and where all that is, but also out at the edge where those people are and where those things are. Things at the edge of the network are a major concern. We're now seeing intermediary networks being used to aggregate a lot of small devices in a deployment and then carrying that back to the head end. It gets more and more complex. They are probably the hardest devices to protect. So the edge is every bit as critical as the core, and you need to pay attention to both. Recommended that you segment your network with the micro boundaries that Kindervag talked about. It is ostensibly easier to manage each small thing than it is to manage one huge, giant thing. And so you want to be able to network, you want to be able to manage each of the segments separately. It also helps with troubleshooting if you can quickly troubleshoot it down to a specific segment and then focus your efforts there. This means you're going to be redefining boundaries not based on perimeters, but rather based on what and who is in that segment. This suggests that you want to be able to use virtual LANs so that you have control over each segmented environment on a local level as well as the wide area network. Also, and this is much less technical, expectations have changed. Used to be that a lot of us spent a lot of time reporting to our users what's wrong, and we figured out what it is, and, oh, isn't that good, and they don't care. The fact is they want you to find the problem, identify what's causing it, and fix it, even before they knew it was a problem. They want it done instantly. And it's not just the users. Don't blame the users. It's competition. You're up against others who are getting that done. The faster we can get something back into service, the faster we can increase our competitiveness in our marketplace. So you're a big part of the business and how the business goes to market. Therefore, an outage is your enemy, and you've got to fix that enemy as fast as you possibly can. When you look for platforms, ask that question. How quickly can I get to resolution? Which brings us to the data residing on the network. And of course, if there is a data asset out there, you want to see it. So data visibility is crucial. And again, in context. What is this data? Where is it? Who's using it? Using what applications? And perhaps most important, how much is this data asset worth? What's the value of this data asset? I don't want to be spending more on protecting it than it's worth, but also I want to know just how critical it is to the enterprise. So therefore, value is a big part of that. The next one is a best practice that is universal if you're doing anything in a network in IT, and that is encryption. Not just in transit when data is going from place to place, but also when data is at rest in storage, because it can be attacked at either of those times, and therefore it has to be protected. And encryption is truly your last line of defense. If somebody gets through everything else and they encounter encrypted data, they better have access to the key, because otherwise all they've got is nonsense, something they can do nothing with, except perhaps corrupt or destroy it. And that's bad too. But encryption in transit and at rest, burn that into your brain, and you will protect yourself against a substantial proportion of the problems that are out there. Use a central directory application so that you have complete control and visibility of all your objects in one place. And know your data. Again, a universal. Understand what each data asset is for. Understand how critical each one is from a functional standpoint, an operational standpoint, as well as a financial standpoint. And then we get to people. You in IT management have one priority, which is security. Many users have another priority, which is ease of use. So you want it to be secure, but your users want it to be frictionless. They want to just glide through. You've got to strike a compromise. And you can strike a good compromise. It's just focus on it. Spend some time on it. Make sure that everybody is getting what they want, if at all possible. Again, when it comes to people, give each one only the access that they need. Apply a policy of least privilege, not universal privilege. Giving everybody an administrator password is lazy. Lazy usually turns into disaster. We're seeing a big movement toward retiring passwords completely. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that I presented that Microsoft had announced the death of passwords. There will be no more passwords. That still hasn't happened, but it can, and it will. Ultimately, passwords are a bad idea. People record them incautiously, carelessly, and therefore they can be stolen. A device-generated code, it's a much better idea because it's a new one every 60 seconds, and so it's impossible to steal. Biotechnology, a fingerprint or a retina scan, we're going to see more and more of that as time goes forward. Why? Because frankly, the overwhelming majority of exploits involve social engineering. That is, they're not attacking the equipment, they're attacking the users, the people. Because again, people are fallible. People are not consistent. They don't do the same thing the same way every time. They're subject to moods. They're subject to just absent-mindedness. That's why engineers refer, when I ask an engineer, what's the hardest part of a network for you to manage? They tell me that the part existing between the keyboard and the chair, that's it. The part existing between the keyboard and the chair, the PEBCAC, that is the hardest part of the network for us to manage. Okay, so everything that we've been talking about up till now are best practices, some of which may be new to some of you, but all of which have been in place for some time. They're getting better in many cases. But there are some new ones that have been added recently that, well, as you see them, you're going to see that they should have been there all along. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So these new best practices fall into several categories, beginning with assessment, outcomes, business outcomes, policy, that wasn't mentioned, user training, focusing not just on people, but the training of those people, Incident management, what happens when something gets through anyway? Documentation, a crucial piece. And then finally, the idea of zero trust being a living plan. Let's go through these. Starting with assessment. Begin by conducting a comprehensive assessment of your current security condition. What is your current state? What protections are in place? When was the last time they were audited? You want to know every firewall, every IPS, every authentication measure, every anti-malware provision, everything. You want to have a complete assessment of all of that, and of course an assessment of the network and all of its resources and assets. As you approach this assessment, you want to begin to stop thinking about it as an attack surface or a threat surface, and you want to start thinking about it as a protect surface, where you're going to protect these things. And now all those things are in your inventory. You suddenly have a complete picture of what it is you need to protect. It's very clear. This includes a complete inventory of endpoints, users, peripherals, all kinds of devices, IoT devices. Those have got to be in your assessment as well. You need to understand your current state in its entirety, a statewide. Okay. The next thing you need to collect are the desired outcomes. What is your desired future state? What are the business outcomes that you're establishing zero trust to protect? Because ultimately, even the data assets and the resources aren't the end game. The end game are the business outcomes, the successful business outcomes that drive more profits for your stakeholders. Base everything that you're going to do on those business objectives, those goals. It's not enough to say, we've improved security by 89%. I don't know how you did that, but I'd rather hear profits increased last quarter by 8.9%. And that's when somebody is allocating funds to your project. That's what they're thinking about. Don't be in a rush. I've probably said this about everything I've ever presented on. Don't rush. Don't rush willy-nilly into just throwing something in there. Consider gradual deployment. Go by workload, one workload at a time, to make sure that if you made a mistake, you can still back out. And to learn on each deployment so that you do better the next time, and the next time, and the next time. The time you take now will save you endless amounts of time later. So go slow. Go stepwise. If you've seen anything in the conversation we've had so far, it is that there is no such product as zero trust. I think we already have a question about that from one of you. Zero trust is not a product. You can't go out and buy it off the shelf. It's a strategy. Now, you can hire people who know that strategy, they've been trained in it, or you can engage professional consultants to do that with you. But whatever you do, you want to approach zero trust with experts in tow, people who understand what it looks like when it's done right. And those people are just as important as anything else you bring to the table when you're deploying zero trust. Policy. Understand that policy is there to determine and to document what we do in every situation, as many situations as we can. The products that we put in place, the firewalls and intrusion prevention systems, the anti-malware, everything, they're all there to enforce the policy. So if you have no policy, you're putting those devices in for no reason. They have no policy to enforce. Absorb that rule, run by that rule, and it'll serve you in a million ways. When it comes to zero trust, your policies have to be based on what your key risks are. And as you go forward, keep establishing new policies as you move down through the levels of risk. But start at the top. Start with the most critical risks and establish the policies that will govern them. Remembering that policies, yeah, they're applied to devices, but they're really primarily meant for users. This is what people do. I mean, think about regulatory compliance. Yeah, there's some devices involved, but really, when we prepare for an audit, we check what people are doing. Are they recording things properly? Are they recording things in a timely fashion? That's what regulatory compliance is all about. It's also what zero trust is about, and a big chunk of what security is about. Again, the overwhelming number of compromises involve social engineering. People attack people because people are easier to successfully attack. So your policies are meant for your users as well. Establish boundaries for exception handling. That is, in any set of policies, any set of rules, there are going to be exceptions. But there are going to be requests for exceptions that go beyond the pale. You need to understand where that line is. That, yeah, you can do this because it's before the line, but you just can't make that exception because it goes beyond your limitations. That becomes important at the worst possible times, because when people are asking for exceptions, it's usually because there's something wrong. Remember that zero trust policies are based on identity, not perimeter. And you know, you need to ordinate.
Please stand by. We are experiencing a momentary interruption in today's conference.
Sorry about that, folks. These presentations have a lot of moving parts. We've got people dialing in from all over the world, so sometimes things go wrong. Please bear with us, and we'll get Howard right back on the line.
Please go ahead.
Hi. Sorry about getting disconnected there. David, where did I leave off? Where did you stop hearing
about fundamental network and data hygiene best practices.
Okay. So it just happened. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Fundamental networking data hygiene is something everybody should receive training on. If cybersecurity is everybody's responsibility, everybody should really receive training on it. You're going to be making big changes. And RBAC and least privilege access, they're just two of the changes that users may see. They may sense them. It's important to explain it to them. As you're making these changes, it's helpful to explain zero trust to your user community so that they understand why things are changing around them. The fewer surprises you can inflict upon people, the better. Also, be sure to clarify user responsibilities. Everybody's working in a shared responsibility model. IT management has responsibilities. Your carriers have some responsibility. Your cloud providers have some responsibility. And your users have some responsibility. So therefore, they need to understand where their responsibilities begin and end. And the better they understand it, the better they'll adhere to it. In net, when you're moving to zero trust, make sure they understand the difference, that it's no longer perimeter security as much as it is identity-based security. That's why we're interrogating them a little bit more, to make sure that they are who they say they are. And in doing so, we're protecting them as well as the network, because compromises hurt everybody. I can't emphasize enough that people tend to drift away. People tend to forget some things they've been trained on. they fall back into bad habits. Constant refreshers are the only solution. Have a monthly security day or a monthly zero trust. We're going to have a party tomorrow. We're all going to get together and not trust each other. Sounds silly, but maybe silly is good. Maybe it gets their attention. Another facet of zero trust that was oddly missing in the early models is the idea of incident management. You can't assume that nothing will ever go wrong, even in zero trust. And so you need to have policies in place that define what you're going to do if something happens. This needs to be incorporated into your user training so your users know what they have to do. If all of a sudden they get a bulletin on their screen that they've been hit with malware and they've got to pay a ransom, they have to know exactly what to do in that circumstance so that they do it immediately and they do it properly. You want to raise awareness enterprise-wide so that you can accelerate that incident reporting. This is crucial. People have to know what to do before they can do it fast. Also, you've probably all heard of SIEM, a security information and event management solution. Find the right platform. Identify the right platform for your environment so that you have something monitoring at all times and automating or helping to automate your response should something go wrong. Okay. Documentation. This has been a pet peeve of mine for the whole 40 some odd years that I've been in IT. If you don't document it, you're shortchanging yourself and those people who will follow you. You have to make sure that complete, comprehensive documentation is available readily and rapidly to everybody. It may be different documentation for users than it is for network managers, but whoever it is, that runbook, what we used to call them, that documentation of how everything is configured and how everything works, that's crucial. And because you're not always going to be there. And even if you are, you're not always going to have the same responsibilities. New people will join, and they will assume some responsibility. They have to be able to know exactly what to do. Within that documentation, you want to make sure that you're evaluating performance against your policies. And that's a great idea. So start by establishing a baseline. When you publish your documentation, publish the current baseline with it. And then in the future, you can base all of your metrics by comparison to that baseline. How much better have we gotten? Which finally brings us to my last major point, which is the concept that zero trust is a changing thing. It's a living plan. It won't be the same for very long periods of time. New applications will come aboard. New threats hit the network every day. Your plan has to be flexible and agile so that it changes as those problems change. One way in which you can improve your odds is to conduct frequent audits and pen testing. Testing for if anybody has gotten through everything. Audits and pen testing basically say send somebody in to try to break in. If they can break in, go into high gear, figuring out how they broke in and fix that. The more often, it's kind of like backup. Yeah, it backed up the data, but will it restore? You don't know unless you test. So testing is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Recognize and appreciate in the context of your people. The zero trust model is complex. I think the first time I presented it, there were like 24 different products and services integrated to create a zero trust model. That's insane. It's an insane number of entities that you have to manage. Make sure that your users understand that your stakeholders understand that, that they appreciate that, yes, this is very complex, but it's what we have to do to more than adequately protect ourselves. At the same time, don't spend all your time analyzing what went wrong. Sometimes root cause analysis is a luxury. Take immediate action. Remember, your users need to have their services back up as soon as possible. So remedy first, analyze next. And remember that it's better to commit an error of commission rather than omission. To use a sports analogy, which I seldom do, it's better to go down swinging. Finally, for those of you who like to read up further, from a very objective source, the National Institute for Standards and Technology has several publications. These are their numbers. You can easily Google them on NIST.org, search for them on NIST.org, and they'll tell you more in more depth about zero trust architecture, current best practices, risk management frameworks to help you understand the relationship between zero trust and risk, and planning to build your zero trust architecture. With that, David, I think we still have a couple of minutes left for some questions.
Yes, we do. And I want especially to get to this question from Deborah and the audience. One of the best questions I've seen, Howard. You talked mostly about the nuts and bolts of best practices, and she is asking about company culture. This is a great question. And it says, I do not mean this to sound pessimistic, but how do we get the culture change required to make this work? I have seen breaches due to ignored warnings, poor quality implementation of rules, and so on. This is a very large undertaking involving the entire corporate culture. How do we make people care?
How do we make people care? You make people care when you make people when you make it cost. I hate to go with the stick first. Many companies have instituted penalties if people ignore rules, if people violate them. On the other hand, there is a community of consultants who do nothing but what you just described, Deborah. They are there to help you build in that discipline in your corporate culture. And by the way, they're seeing more and more business all the time. As I mentioned before, DevOps requires this kind of culture change, as does regulatory compliance requires culture change. Anything involving people involves culture change. And so there are culture change consultants who are there to do nothing but. They are experts in adult learning processes, which are different from youth learning processes. They understand the dynamics. I guess I liken it to how do you get people to adopt software? They say that 75% of projects fail because the users fail to adopt. Well, if you look at it carefully, users fail to adopt and users fail to comply for the same reason. And it's not a good reason, but it's the real reason. And that is that they all have the same favorite radio station, WII-FM radio. What's in it for me? What is if I'm going to comply with all these stupid rules, what do I get out of it? Now, that may sound arrogant, and it is. It definitely is arrogant. But the reality is, if you take the time to stop and think about it and translate the changes into what it means to them, if you think about the orientations you've been to, probably didn't really do that. Probably told them the features, the functions, how it works, blah, 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 but didn't really tell them, now, if you do this, here's how much better your life gets. That's the carrot, right? Not the stick. That's the carrot. Well, let's work with the carrot. Let's figure out what is in it for them. Why does it benefit them to heed those warnings and to pay attention to those new rules and to follow them religiously. It's amazing how much ground you'll gain, how much progress you'll make toward enlisting people when you take the time to translate the change into what it means to them. I hope that was helpful.
I think it was. It was a very good answer. And actually, I think addressed another question from in the audience from Jeremiah, who asked a question about the similar same thing. Anyway, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Howard, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you all for your attention, and we'll see you soon.
Okay, everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Enterprise Zero Trust and Your Remote Workforce, Top Do's, Don'ts, and Gotchas. So take this chance to check out those resources on your console provided by Rubrik, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsor Rubrik for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Mastering Zero Trust Summit called Enterprise Zero Trust and Your Remote Workforce, Top Do's, Don'ts, and Gotchas. Our speaker for this session is Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. Ian Thornton-Trump is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. From 1989 to 1992, Ian served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch. In 2002, he joined the CF Military Police Reserves and retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. Today, as Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax Limited and Chief Technical Officer of Octopi Managed Services Incorporated, Ian has a deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and large businesses. His research and experience has made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant, specializing in building security operations, working as a VCISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence for organizations. Take it away, Ian.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and a huge shout-out to the previous speaker who really set the stage for a lot of things that I'm going to talk about. And I just have to say the quality of the information that I've got today is going to blow your mind, because this is going to be a strategic look and also talk about some complete failures and some real problems and challenges that we have, with a bit of an epiphany that I had because what was the name of that astronaut guy again that I always listen to?
Brian Posey.
Brian Posey. Brian Posey and I listened to his presentation on Zero Trust, and man, I picked up a lot of stuff, but I suddenly connected the dots, so there's going to be a bit of an epiphany. Please give a shout out to Rubrik. Follow them on LinkedIn. Follow them on Twitter, please. There's my handles there, at Fat Hobbit on Twitter, and Ian Thornton-Trump on LinkedIn. It would be great. And of course, we're celebrating Hacker Summer Camp coming up, so it's going to be, well, my first DEF CON badge right there, DEF CON 9. I think we're at DEF CON 31 now. So I've been around a little bit, and I want to say that anyone that is in IT, please get a hobby. Mine is helping to produce electronic music. I love it to death, and it certainly takes the mental anguish that we get in this industry off. So just a little mental health caution. Okay, let's get right into it, because I think what we need to do is look at something that came out that is got to be, it started as a philosophy, but then we will get really tripped up on that, and now we're talking about it as a framework, okay? Now, coined by Forrester Research analyst and all-around good guy, international DJ superstar, I made that last part up, but He's lovely. I've met him a couple of times, and if you want to go to the kind of the source, if you will, it's just a great opportunity to have a quick conversation with him too. Because when I started down this road, I wanted to vet out some of the challenges as the way I see them and see kind of how that applies to Zero Trust and all those kind of cool things. So this is, I think, the fundamental place to start, is really about what is the problem that Zero Trust is looking to solve, okay? Now, there are tons of security problems that we have right now in the industry. I mean, we want to stay making security is everyone's responsibility at the organization. However, it's a very hypocritical thing because when security fails, it seems like they want to pin it on one person, usually the CISO, for the security failure. Whether or not that's right or wrong is kind of out of the scope of today's discussion for sure. But this is, I see, first of all, one of the problems that Zero Trust is trying to frame up is really bring everyone to the table as an organization in terms of what can they do to support the business's Zero Trust initiatives, okay? Now, again, one of the fundamental challenges that we have, we certainly can't secure what we can't see, and we've built a lot more complexity in our networks than we've ever had before. We have shadow IT all over the place. Now we call it software as a service, but the bottom line here is shadow IT has infested many different departments using different types of services that are, in some cases, pretty much come as a surprise to the security team. And there's a little caveat that we'll talk about in terms of recent challenges with that, because you can be breached by not necessarily being breached. And I'm going to explain to that because it's some huge takeaways that I have on that subject very shortly. But just before we go to my next slide, which talks about that very subject, and perhaps maybe in retrospect I should have put that at the end, let's talk about the legacy IT that we have. This is a huge problem in most organizations. It adds risk for every year that it's not remediated. It adds, potential for unrecoverable disaster should it have a physical issue or event, or a cyber event where the legacy setups are unknown to the organization, and it would be impossible to recover or rebuild that particular asset. It is crazy, but as I like to say, when I go into a server room and I see beige things, I'm like, they gotta go, okay? Because they're just risk sitting there in a lot of cases. Now, quantifiable risk, we're going to talk about that in this presentation on Zero Trust for sure, but we do need to have that discussion as well. The other thing that we're really challenged is the inability of the organization to deliver an IT project. And this is where now I think we've matured because I'm seeing a lot more project management offices, PMO organizations, where they have overall command of the project initiatives to try and what? Unify the direction and strategy that the business has decided on so that all of the projects contribute to the greater, efficiency, greater profitability of the organization. So an IT project, in my mind, is no longer an applicable term, and it's a business project, because if the business isn't involved, the IT project is probably going to fail, okay? The next piece of this is the visibility required now into an organization's supply chain. And I think I put that one in specifically because of this next question. And I put a QR code to a breaking story that happened, I guess, yesterday. The article came out live. We talked about these data breaches from the Clop ransomware cybercrime group. Ernst & Young fell victim to them, as did PwC, two of the big four accounting firms. And in this particular data breach, we learned that there's 62 actual client data leaks, with the majority of them in Canada, which is quite interesting in of itself. But we're talking about all kinds of sensitive data. And this is the you can be breached without being breached part of the presentation, which in some ways we do need to kind of circle back to Zero Trust and talk about that. Now, we are coming up to the actual epiphany that I had here, because I started reading. I went to this great website because I always want to drop some of the latest statistics. And the epiphany that I came to after reading a few of these statistics, and if you're ever need to build a business case, I highly recommend this particular website to look at what the feeling is out there, okay? Now, this thing by Deloitte was really interesting to me, that, 50% of the IT department's budget is spent on maintenance, okay? Maintenance of the existing infrastructure, keeping it going, backing it up, the care and feeding, the vulnerability management. 19% is allocated to investment. And I think that number is overzealous, because I think when you talk about salaries, it may be even less in that. You also see 72% of IT budgets being spent on existing IT issues, with 28% on innovations. That's, we got to flip that on its head. And I think, Zero Trust, or as I'm going to talk to you about the epiphany shortly, and it came from this line. And listening to, my learned colleagues on this, successful digital transformation is 6 times more likely in organizations engaged with a chief digital officer. So someone to wrangle all of the digital assets that we have under one roof. Here it comes. Executives say that the top advantages of digital transformation are improved operational efficiencies, 40%, faster time to market, 36%, and increased ability to satisfy customer expectations, 35%. It sounds like digital transformation is amazing. So why don't we start talking about hitching digital transformation to the Zero Trust framework? Bum-ba-da-da. Okay, because if we're really talking about a unifying idea to apply Zero Trust as a framework, let's start baking it in. Let's get into the conversations in organizations about how Zero Trust supports and is an outcome of digital transformation. I know I thought it was a little bit brilliant, but, some of the audience might go, Ian, this is nothing new. Of course it's part of it. But I think it's a way of getting higher up the food chain and not looking at this as a set of IT tools or even a set of policies. However, when I go to kind of what my 7 steps of super success in hitching the train, the Zero Trust framework to the digital transformation train, we have so many opportunities here. We have to have a policy. Then we have to have a strategy. Then we have to have the 3-phase plan. And I'm going to share with you my 3-phase plan on how to get there. We have to look at our resources and our capabilities and our inventory. What do I mean by that? This is the humans that are going to try and execute the idea of moving Zero Trust framework into the realm of digital transformation within an organization. And I think it's really, really important here to know your strengths. And looking at the previous page of statistics, it doesn't look like there's a lot of extra capacity in anybody's IT department. So we really have to think about how do we align our IT resources, our security resources, with the business transformation that is about to occur, right? Now, you heard this from my previous speaker, Howard. Shout out to him, man. He is talking about, testing, the lab POC, as I like to call it, or potentially one department that you can start looking at implementing these things in order to prove to the organization that there's capabilities here. And then, of course, you have to revise the 3-phase plan and the budget, of course, because there's going to be gotchas, there's going to be unknowns, and then execute phase 1 of the 3-phase plan. Now, we're going to get into that, but I just want you to kind of hold in position that for 1 second, because I'm just going to try and, here we go. Okay. So I believe you cannot deliver organizational zero trust in isolation. So it's not an IT or an IT security solution. This is an organizational challenge and opportunity. And this is why I think it needs to come under the whole lid of digital transformation within an organization. Now, I said I would share the three-phase plan with you. It's a simple mission, but it's complex in that what we need to look at is the visibility of all the things, okay? So that's all the ITAM, all the assets, the data. Then we move to automation, and then we move to orchestration. Now, these are not hard and fast phases because some of you have maybe purchased capabilities or even implemented some things that already are at the automation point. Managed detection and response is a great feature of something like endpoint automation, orchestration. Some of you are already very comfortable or have tools to deploy software in mass to the organization. We can talk about the front of house rules about who gets that software, but a lot of orchestration pieces are already out there. So where to start really is about looking at our actual diagram here and looking at probably the first step, and I think my previous presenter said this as well, identity and access management, role-based authentication, and privileged management, all under the IDAM, as we used to call it. IDM now is what the cool kids are calling it because we like three-letter acronyms apparently better than we like four-letter acronyms. The point here is this is a hybrid problem for the organization. Now, you may laugh, but when I say that the single source of truth for who is working at your organization has probably got to be the payroll system. And I know many organizations that the first thing that they do is they either go out and they buy a solution to graft onto the HR system, API, automatic service, desk ticketing, whatever you want to do, so that when someone new is hired, they're assigned a role, and based on that role, that's what they get for permissions, that's what they get for software licenses, et cetera, et cetera. It all has to start at identity and access management. And I love to say that when you start talking about zero trust, this is a fundamental. If you don't know who's working for you, that is a problem that needs to be solved before you do thing one in terms of cybersecurity framework or anything. And this is the one thing that I think we can agree we're going to be 100% certain on. Now, yes, contractors and vendors play a part in this identity and access management piece as well, because they may need access to your system. They may need access to certain parts of the organization, especially if you have a bunch of OT vendors, they will need access into the OT environment. If you're in a hospital, many of the vendors have persistent VPN connections into the modalities or the PACS-RIS system that is there. So identity is a major focus of starting your journey towards zero trust framework as part of an overall digital transformation opportunity within your organization. All right. Now, I'm going to actually go now to the other side of it. And here is like a supply chain management problem. Because to be fair, you can't monitor your ISP really if they're doing a bunch of crazy unsafe things on their edge that you plug your firewalls into. You're not going to see about it or know about it. In fact, their firewall could be compromised. Their little DSL box could be compromised and be part of a botnet, and you're not even seeing that data. It's really hard to look at your upstream providers. So you've got to trust someone here. And this is what I said about infrastructure too. Now, infrastructure in my mind is both your hosted environments and even your on-premise. When you talk about infrastructure, you have to have an understanding that that's going to be part of your IoT, that's going to be part of the underlying switching and infrastructure that you have, even the stuff that you're buying from cloud providers, et cetera, et cetera. So there has to be a trust but verify policy for these particular vendors, which you're going to not have a lot of visibility on just to the nature, right? And so this is where working with procurement, the counsel's office, your governance and risk, the chief financial officer, IT architect, and those third-party providers really become almost a managerial function of an IT and IT security organization, because there's not a lot of things that they can see. Even if they open the hood, there's a lot of stuff below, sort of the air intake, below that you just don't know anything about and you don't have a ton of visibility on. So in a way, this is now a way of engaging a lot of the different parts of the organization in determining, the level of trust, and then what the art of visibility, automation, and orchestration controls can be. But it's going to have to be in conjunction with that third-party management firm, which now leads us into the endpoint discussion. And this is the fundamental thing of visibility of your endpoints. That's like, you need to know what's on your network. And there are a lot of solutions out there in terms of asset discovery, in terms of understanding what's connecting, what's remotely connecting, how you're going to manage that, making sure that devices that are connecting remotely meet certain compliance levels. We see a lot of solutions in the marketplace around that. But this is also when we start to talk about the automation and the orchestration piece of getting the telemetry out of those endpoints to understand what normal behavior looks like versus abnormal. This is all about the ability to standardize on endpoint builds, the ability to lock down endpoints like the IoT devices within your organizations that only need to communicate to maybe one or two domains or a handful of IP addresses. This requires that laboratory. So when you're talking about new conferencing solutions and things like that, it's got to go through some rigorous testing by IT to see how it's going to be deployed. Security has to be involved, and there needs to be a process of signing off on those endpoints to make sure that they're properly secured and don't have any gaping vulnerabilities like services that you didn't know about that are exploitable, et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing to understand when you're starting to go down this road with the visibility and the automation, the orchestration solutions for endpoint security is your operational security posture versus the user experience across platforms. I give a lot of talks where I talk about leadership in cybersecurity and the effectiveness of a cybersecurity program. And it really comes down to security has a tendency to overreact to a lot of things and make the user experience across platforms difficult. And so this is where the holistic view of the organization has to incorporate all of the different ways that an end user might be accessing data or trying to perform their job. And this includes, unfortunately, sometimes those rogue applications like Dropbox or OneDrive or Mega or WeTransfer, et cetera, et cetera. And if there isn't a viable IT solution that the business has asked IT to approve, you can expect crazy different types of endpoint behavior within your organization, which obviously affect your signal-to-noise ratio, right? And makes it even more challenging. Now, I'm going to go to apps because we already had the discussion of infrastructure and network and how there has to be a certain level of trust. Then equally, and maybe less so, there now has to be that same level of trust within your organization where we start talking about the issues around managed applications, unmanaged applications. So the differentiation on here is in the perfect zero trust world, all applications are managed, okay? Because we know who has them, et cetera, et cetera. We know that they're all properly licensed. You're reducing risk in the organization. That's not necessarily an accurate assessment of a lot of enterprises that may have a lot of unmanaged applications. This can happen as a result of a busy counsel's office that needs DocuSign, or a bunch of Adobe products in marketing where it's been expensed through cloud, the Adobe Cloud services. It's been expensed on a credit card, and all of a sudden that makes it a bit difficult to understand the vulnerability management perspective for IT, because at the end of the day, in the perfect kind of utopian world, all apps will be managed. We will have visibility on all apps within our organization, including SaaS, and we're able to uninstall, install, provide permissions, upgrade, and do the complete license management. This is a big one, and this is why a lot of effort is put into vulnerability management, but also in deployment, and then, of course, clawing back licensing when various departments are kind of either combined or maybe even divested within the organization. So license management becomes quite a big issue. And then this actually goes internally as well, in terms of like you have internal software development, but you also in some cases have third parties that are developing software on behalf of your organization, sometimes even customer facing, which is a bit chilling if the security team and the actual IT teams and even the development teams are unaware that those third-party hosted applications, they could even be SaaS, are an integral part of your business and customer facing. This makes it for a very scary kind of discussion around supply chain for sure. The CI/CD pipeline is also a really, really critical in order to be part of the discussion as well. And I think that this is where you now have to really look at the supply chain management from all the tools that go into software development, which includes SBOM and a bunch of other different things like for checking for static and dynamic testing, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think that that's a really important concept to understand, that this will also affect the development in-house when you look at applying the Zero Trust framework to the organization. Now, as we move along, this is the potential ugly thing that we have within most enterprise organizations. It's data management. Now, and I'm all for bringing the organization together because you need a talented communicator within IT and IT security, especially, including, and you might even be able to do this through the conduit of BCP and disaster recovery, because basically data is everywhere in organizations, and a lot of it is no longer needed. When you look at your daily backups, you'll find, especially if you're cloud-based and you're charged for storage, if you're using even blobs or S3 buckets, you'll find that that cost goes up and up and up because no one's getting rid of the stuff that is no longer needed in the organization. And I will now go into the short rant on why Microsoft is absolutely an evil genius when it comes to data. And it has to do with the tight integration that we have now between the various Microsoft applications and data retention within cloud storage. SharePoint especially and OneDrive absolutely have a default retention of 7 years. And this is where, we've kind of made a complete mess of things because essentially we've been in a situation where data pack rats, in some cases, that's legitimate. There are some things like legal documents that are required, for the length of the will or trust, for instance, has indefinite retention requirements. But not a lot of the data of the organization, especially if it's not considered a business record and subject to a data retention policy put in place by the IRS in the United States or HMRC here in the UK. There's a lot of stuff that can be deleted. But interestingly enough, when you talk about cloud storage, even though you've deleted it, that deletion will not take place until either the data retention policy is released and those files are deleted, or it ages out to 7 years. So some of the architectures, when you talk about this, is you may have to have a talented SharePoint person do some actual training with the business to try and manage their data. I like to say that there's one company out there that will go through and will analyze and look at all of your unstructured data and then give you a report that is just soul destroying when you realize it's going to take, the distance between our solar system to get to another solar system in terms of wrangling it. It has to be an all-out effort. Otherwise, you will find your Azure bill will continue to accelerate out of control. And this is as a result of our really bad practices of, just as I like to call it, you only live once file transfer of data from the old shared drive to OneDrive or SharePoint, which of course resets the clock when you copy it off the shared drive and onto the new OneDrive or SharePoint. A SharePoint and OneDrive look at this is the first time they've ever seen this file, so it's subject to that mandatory 7-year data retention that is there unless you adjust it. So there really needs to be, when you talk about managing both your Azure costs, there really has to be a discussion around the potential acceleration of your Azure costs out of control because of the pack rat mentality we have. Now, why did I suggest for a moment that this was a brilliant strategy that Microsoft has pushed out on this? It's because they want to send you the mother of all Azure bills. And it will continue to happen if the retention policy isn't looked at, if the deletion policy, and as I mentioned earlier on the slide, the number of revisions of that particular file which are stored. And a revision essentially occurs every time you alter that file so that you can undo up to 500 layers. And I'll tell you this right now, I've maybe used the undo function for a couple of layers in my life, but I've never gone more than 10 or 15. The default is 500 revisions of a file with the fact all subject to the same 7-year data retention policy, unless you adjust that, plus your actual problem of the Microsoft on OneDrive and Office 365 experience, even with internal email, creates a complete copy of that file. It's no longer a pointer. And what do I mean by this? Way, way back in the great old days, if you will, of on-premise Exchange servers, Microsoft used a pointer between a Word document emailed between two people in the same tenant. My understanding is they understand how it is a money-making ATM machine for Microsoft to not put a pointer and put a whole nother copy of that file onto the system. And so because one of the major criticisms of Microsoft is the fact that they think that the internet, high-speed internet, high reliable speed internet is available everywhere and nobody should be working offline, this is why you get a lot of sensitive data documents that the permissions have been enabled for them to be stored locally, which in some cases can now be stripped of any security settings you had on that document. So there is another problem here that needs to be looked at in terms of how you're managing cloud storage like the way we used to do back in the old day. And you're running into a problem when you start seeing a plethora of IT service tickets that are run out of shared drive or space, run out of SharePoint space, need more SharePoint. It's time to sit down with the business and really work on data management with the business as part of that zero trust piece of trying to understand how you're going to do automatic archiving or automatic deletion or et cetera of those files, and how you're going to do it in such a way that it doesn't continuously add to your as-your bill. So now I want to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about a few of the gotchas before we get into the Q&A. The first is really talking about the difference, and I've been very careful, I hope, with my language in understanding that Zero Trust is a framework that is going to support the digital transformation of your organization. Do not call it a philosophy, even though the guy that invented it with trust but verify, I don't quite think he understood how he could have unleashed the real problem that if you apply trust but verify to any business relationship, it may end in a suboptimal way. Questioning, people in your organization, but it can't be done in a disrespectful manner. And I think what we need to see is that if we're going to be engaging with the business in the digital transformation strategy, you have to be aware of the organization has other needs than just IT and IT security. The biggest one being that need to make money to pay everyone and, of course, have some return on to owners and shareholders. Very, very important to understand. So please call it a framework, a Zero Trust framework. Try not to think of it as a philosophical exercise because it could change your attitude in a non-positive way. Now, because you're going to be reaching out to the business and working with digital transformation to bring in elements of Zero Trust into that, you have to adjust your attitude. So the first one that I like to say is really about the razors, and you can see the razor crest from The Mandalorian. A shout out to those Star Wars fans out there. But we need to come to grips with the fact that when we are sitting about and talking about security or IT delivery, we need to keep it very simple, okay? These folks are not well educated. In many cases, all they want at the senior vice president level is to feel less pain across the organization. The less pain you are, the more often you will get their attention and support. The more painful you are with unclear explanations and an overuse of jargon, be prepared to slowly be moved to the outside offices and perhaps even deployed to the Anchorage, Alaska office. So this is really, really important to really think about how do we create an atmosphere where we explain things very simply about what we need to accomplish or what the obstacle is. The second thing, and I can underscore this is going to save your careers as you start interfacing with the business at even a high level, a managerial level, even subject matter expert level. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity or a human mistake, okay? Because a lot of the folks read into this and have a terrible mindset when it comes to change within their organization. And as you can see, I'm steering the ship into those waters. And I started to look at this from a very philosophical, kind of almost cybersecurity Zen, IT Zen approach. We're going to have to expect the unexpected. This is the world that we live in. We come into work and everything's working. We go home and all of a sudden everything seems to be not working. And after checking DNS, as a little joke for everyone, we then go through a process of determining what is broken. But I think, Marcus Aurelius said it that about never let the future disturb you, okay? You'll need it if you have to. It's going to be inevitable with the same weapons of reason which arm you today. Try not to get emotional. And also understand that not knowing everything is fine because the future by default is uncertain to begin with. Now, can we see things coming? Yes, of course. Because if your partner sends you a text message and says, we have to talk, where default position on that is probably the talking to is not going to be a positive one. Okay? So yes, but keep an open mind is what I'm saying when you're dealing with the business, when you're trying to hitch your zero trust framework into the digital transformation that your organization is undergoing, and understand the stresses that everyone is up against. And if you kind of come through that realm, then you're going to be in good shape. Now, I think what I'm going to do at this point is I really want to go back to this issue here, and I'm going to push this slide because I have a bit more time before we go into the Q&A. Now, this data breach by Clop happened as a result of the issues around the MoveIt appliance or service. Basically, what happened is a series of SQLi injections were found in this appliance. They were found and they've been patched, and we're on our third patch from MoveIt. But the remote code exploitation was based on the use of, and you folks are ready for this, FTP, okay? Not HTTPS, like we should be using in these configurations. But yes, file transfer protocol that has its roots in the 1970s. This is what I'm talking about, the beige boxes. And to be fair, I've never seen a MoveIt box. Many of you might have them and are madly trying to keep it from getting pwned by the Clop cybercrime group and others. But the point here is that I'm saying is that the older your stuff has on your risk register, the more it needs to be part of overall digital transformation, i.e., how can we get rid of it and what can we replace it with? And that's where IT and IT security come in. Well, we have a zero trust framework which could help procurement and you, Mr. Business, find a solution. And oh, by the way, we really think that we should look at a single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, especially that being part of our policy as we digitally transform and put in a bunch of security requirements around our replacements. So I just wanted to make that point because I think I kind of glossed over it the first time. And now I think I'm ready for some Q&A. How about that?
Cool. Yeah, we have quite a few questions, so let's jump right in.
Awesome.
First question. How can I work with my MSSP to help with digital transformation zero trust?
So absolutely, if you do have one, they can be a vital part of this. Now, of course, it comes down to the terms and conditions, the arrangement with that particular MSSP. But the chances are, if you've gone out and you've got that resource, you now want to look at the type of tech stack that they're deploying and find a way, because at the end of the day, you want to kind of make a heat map of, do we have visibility on anything? Like, can we test that MSSP? Can I plug something into a switch? And how long does it take before they'll notice that, oh, by the way, it's not even part of the domain and it's trying to reach outside the network? There are great opportunities to work hand in hand with the MSSP and start implementing some of these technologies. And it depends on what you've outsourced to them as well. Because I know many of the high-level MSPs that are out there that they're going to deploy things like CyberArk. They're going to deploy some of the top technologies that are out there. They're going to suggest that you automate the creation of users in Active Directory from a single source of truth. It starts with sort of generating service tickets to do stuff, but it ends with a seamless automated and orchestration deployment, which will save the IT department, kind of a lot of cycles of deployments where now you need to do a bunch of custom stuff. Even the simple scripting of giving people access to printers is a fundamental part of that automation piece and that orchestration piece in your organization. So, with the MSSP, and when you kind of rephrase the discussion and say, how can you support digital transformation? What zero trust capabilities have you deployed within our organization? How can I get a tangible view of that stuff in action? Azure Sentinel is a great example of being able to detect that anomalous behavior. Do you have the use cases in that system to identify and then triage and, if necessary, investigate? So yeah, it's a huge part of the journey.
Okay, great. Howard kind of touched on this in his presentation last hour. I kind of want to get your perspective on Jeremiah's question. What do you see has been the biggest obstacle in instilling the corporate culture of zero trust? And what are some ways we can avoid them?
And that was my whole central epiphany, is that we try to look at this as just an IT and an IT security thing when it needs to be part of the redo, if you will, of digital transformation. And fundamentally, this is all IT needs to say. Yes, we can take those on-premise servers, that old clunky tin, and we could put them into the cloud. But we need some technology to wrap around it, because just moving it P2V into the cloud on the same VMware stack, that doesn't add any value, because if it's old and clunky and vulnerable, we need to start the discussion around the technology we need to deploy in front of it to make it safe. And that starts with things like, is it using strong cryptography, for instance? Is it externally exposed to the internet, or is it an internal thing only? Can we segment it off? How do we protect the APIs? This is like a whole part of understanding the cloud security architecture skills that you need to have in the IT or IT security or DevSecOps arena to support all of these things that you want to do. And accept the fact that you're going to have to probably trust sometimes a little bit more than you're comfortable with, just because the business isn't prepared to shell out for the big upgrade to the latest version of Oracle, or the big upgrade to the latest version of Red Hat. You may have to live with that legacy stuff, but you sure can help build a perimeter around it to protect it as much as possible through things like secure web gateways and things like that.
Okay, great. Here's a great question. I want to enhance our security awareness training because it's best ROI. How do I make the case that this is part of Zero Trust?
Yeah, absolutely. So that whole part of the user goes back to a bunch of check boxes that HR has that can now kind of become an automated process. And it's all about making sure the folks are onboarded properly and the documents are signed, and that the training, the cybersecurity training is happening there. And then expand out that training and say, okay, maybe we're going to have biannual training exercise. Maybe we're going to do it quarterly. I think PCI DSS, requires it quarterly, even, if I'm not sure. But there is opportunities here to digitally transform, and that doesn't just mean data. It means the people too. And at least now you can have this common thing to talk about when you're talking about the digital transformations the organization is currently going under or happening, and say, listen, there'd be some tangible benefit to having more robust user awareness training, and will make it easier and cause us less cycles and reduce our risk. Because at the end of the day, what you need to do is say, one of the benefits of that Zero Trust framework helping with digital transformation is to reduce risk in the organization, right? Across a whole bunch of things. Can be physical risk. It can be, insider threat risk. It can be external attacker risk. So all of that stuff, you need to really actually, to be fair, become a bit of a salesperson to try and help support the struggles that the business is probably having at that apps level as the legacy stuff becomes more and more untenable.
Okay. Jamal wants to know, what is the main strategies for zero trust in the case of cloud first IT?
Exactly. Make sure you have folks with the skill set to secure cloud-based IT. Make sure that you have a solid testing laboratory and or dev environment. Make sure your tools are fit for purpose and that you have the visibility on the activity, whether or not that's Cloud Shield or Azure Sentinel, depending on what platform you're existing in. And by all means, once you've detected a problem, understand and have an IR capability. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody, has to be, IR trained and everything like that. But you better have a business partner or someone that can help you, deal with cloud incident response, which is a bit different than an on-premise network penetration. So again, you have to think about the training and the strategy for IT to deliver into that cloud-based environment. And again, because that's what, a lot of organizations are currently looking at, is like, hey, I've got a huge bill coming up for on-premise. I want to start moving off that legacy hardware, anything beige, to the cloud, but I still need the assurance that it's protected by all the stuff that we have right now, which means, web application firewalls, which means, security audits and review, if not a fan of pen testing production, but pen testing a development environment and trying to knock it over is a great exercise to do as well. So just make sure that you understand that and your tooling is fit for purpose and it's meeting that capabilities matrix that I talked about, gaining visibility over the assets, then looking at the opportunities to automate either building, or code deployment, and then looking at that orchestration piece that is all about, scalability, and of course, reduction when those extra services are not required. And overarching all of this is to have a good understanding of your architecture. There's a lot of discussion in the Amazon community right now over the differences between microservice architecture and the scalability of that versus something like monolith and the costs that are involved. There's a great blog post out there about AWS, Amazon Prime, saving 90% on their bill because rather than going with microservice architecture, they moved to monolith. So it may be appropriate to start looking at those new services, those new offerings that, to be fair, monolith has been around for a long time, but there's other types of database optimizations as well. And I didn't know this, but AWS, I think, has 17 different types of databases available in the Amazon marketplace that are applicable to sort of like different types of data that you need to store. So again, make sure you're on top of this stuff and it's fit for purpose.
Okay, let's try to get a question or two more before the session ends here.
Sure.
This one gave me a good chuckle. What do you recommend for supply chain security management? Please don't say a security questionnaire on an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, the death of us all, right? What did they say? The first 500 of those is the most painful. No, here's the thing. We're moving away from this because, to be fair, every answer should be, I don't really know. And we had some crazy data breach here in the UK where a big firm got breached and they said, well, it was only like 1% of our infrastructure. Yeah, but it happened to be the infrastructure where there's tons of sensitive data on it, right? So that was like the lamest claim ever. But the problem is, we have two problems in IT. Nothing is black and white. It depends is used all the time. And I don't think there's anyone out there that can attest to the fact that they have 100% of the visibility of their assets, right? We're always dealing with the balance of probabilities. So what I like to do here is really talk about the language that you need in procurement contracts that is really not, that is like, if we have a data incident, what does the cooperation look like between our organization and your organization? Do we have it built in that you're going to tell us if you get data breached and what the nature of that data breach was, if any of our data was exposed? A lot of it is about developing developing those relationships based on the contract, but also monitoring and getting your CTI team, getting your cyber threat intelligence team to monitor that supply chain. If their information is available on the dark web, that's something you might want to bring to their attention in hopes that you develop a quid pro quo. Because at the end of the day, your business wouldn't exist without your supply chain partners, and those supply chain partners would have difficulty existing without you as a customer. So really, I think the new way to approach this issue is not to be so adversarial that we continuously kind of focus on, but to actually start building cooperation between the two and having an open and honest relationship, almost, trust but verify.
Yeah. All right, let's close out with this question from Matt. We had a ransomware event with data exfiltration about 3 years ago and spent a lot on a security solution. What should we worry about now, and how will Zero Trust mitigate the threat?
So there's a couple of areas that I want to point out. Without knowing exactly how the bad guys got into the organization, we've kind of switched away from credentials, because fortunately MFA has been a more widely adopted. That helps a lot, I think, from CISA and other organizations pounding at that drum as a major mitigation. But credential stealing is still a big thing. But what we're seeing now, and this is sort of like a double-edged sword, is one, legacy equipment, Exchange on-premise, Fortinet OS, WatchGuard Firewall OS, not having that stuff kept up to date is deadly, and that's what's causing a lot of ransomware. The MoveIt appliance being the one that Clop chose to rapidly exploit by the weaponization of attacks on that infrastructure. It's that old stuff that we have exposed that is starting to kill us. The other thing that is sort of like in the future, and this goes directly back when I talked about internal applications or externally exposed applications that are in-house developed or third-party, we need to continuously monitor those for signs and indications of compromise, because and even though it passes a pen test, we have to look at the possible attack chains of those APIs. Maybe not so much the web front end now that we are I think moving better its security on top of. We're starting to write in languages in terms of getting away from things like PHP, where you can do really bad things, into Node, JS, that basically, to be fair, is harder to do bad things with in terms of poor security. But we have to look at things, the basics like content security policy to prevent cross-site scripting attacks, SRR, server resource integrity checking. It takes a bit of effort, but I feel like we're moving in that direction. But the area where we're really exposed to APIs, and I suspect that the next layer of attacks will be attacks on third-party chatbots that have API links into your own back-end databases, and bad guys being able to draw information, potentially sensitive account information, from poorly secured APIs from third-party plugins on actual corporate websites. I know that's a big attack chain, but I'm starting to see it kind of come to fruition, because that's sort of like the new soft, juicy part, the area that is rapidly expanding in growth. And we know sometimes lowest bid wins, especially in some companies, and the security around that, those connections may not be nearly as robust as we think it should be or would like it to be.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Thanks for the awesome talk, Ian.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Shout out to Rubrik for making it happen.